It was the winter of 1919, and Europe was still bleeding. The Great War, what we now call World War I, had just ended, leaving behind cities in ruins, nations in despair, and a generation of young men buried in foreign soil. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of destruction still rolled through every heart. Amidst the ashes of empires and the cries for peace, the world's leaders gathered in Paris to rebuild what had been shattered. They had one desperate mission: to ensure that the horrors of such a war would never return. And from that dream, fragile yet full of hope, the League of Nations was born. It was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson who stood as the architect of that dream. In his famous 14 points, Wilson spoke of a new world order, one based on open diplomacy, freedom, justice, and collective security. He imagined a council of nations that would settle disputes not with bombs or bayonets, but with words and cooperation. To many, it sounded like a revolution in human thought, a promise that reason could triumph over revenge, that dialogue could replace destruction. But beneath the shining surface of hope lay cracks that would soon widen into the faults of failure. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, officially ended the war, but it also sowed the seeds of bitterness. Germany was humiliated, forced to accept full responsibility for the war and burdened with crushing reparations. The treaty, rather than healing, reopened wounds. Even as diplomats toasted peace in Paris, resentment simmered in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. Still, the League of Nations was established that same year in Geneva, Switzerland, as the world's first international organization dedicated to maintaining peace. People cheered, newspapers called it the dawn of a new era. For a brief moment, humanity dared to believe that the nightmare was over. Yet, from its very birth, the League carried the weight of contradiction. The most ironic twist came from the United States itself. Although the League was Wilson's own creation, the U.S. Senate refused to join it. American politicians feared that joining would drag their nation into foreign conflicts again. Isolationism triumphed over idealism. Wilson's dream, conceived in Washington, was left orphaned in Europe. Without the economic and military strength of the United States, the League stood like a grand palace built on sand, beautiful, but dangerously unstable. At first, the League seemed to work. In its early years, it resolved minor border disputes, oversaw humanitarian missions, and helped refugees from war-torn regions. Committees worked tirelessly to fight diseases, improve labor conditions, and supervise mandates in former colonies. For a while, newspapers praised its achievements. But the peace it promised was delicate, more illusion than reality. The 1920s were a decade of fragile calm, and behind the scenes, new storms were brewing. The League's foundation rested on collective security, the belief that if one nation acted aggressively, all others would unite to stop it. It was a noble idea, but it required unity, courage, and quick decision-making. Unfortunately, the League had none of these. Decisions could only be made unanimously, meaning even one dissenting vote could block action. Moreover, the League had no army of its own. It depended on the goodwill of its members to enforce sanctions or send troops. As history would show, goodwill evaporates quickly when national interests are at stake. Meanwhile, the world was changing faster than the League could react. In Germany, bitterness over the Versailles Treaty festered into anger, and from that anger rose Adolf Hitler and his promise to restore national pride. In Italy, Benito Mussolini preached about reviving the Roman Empire. In Japan, military leaders began dreaming of Asian domination. All three nations would soon test the League's strength and expose its weakness to the world. But back in the 1920s, these future aggressions were still shadows on the horizon. The League's meetings in Geneva continued with polite speeches, lofty resolutions, and endless optimism. Delegates from across the world gathered in marble halls, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and believing they were building a new world order. The press covered these gatherings as spectacles of unity. Yet, behind the smiles, the League was already showing signs of paralysis. Every major power acted cautiously, unwilling to risk its soldiers or trade interests for distant conflicts. Britain and France, the League's strongest members, were exhausted from the war. Their leaders feared another conflict more than they desired justice. So, whenever small crises arose, the League responded with hesitation or worse, with silence. By the late 1920s, the global economy began to falter. The Great Depression of 1929 struck like a thunderclap, shaking every nation. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and people lost faith in their governments. In such chaos, nationalism and extremism found fertile ground. Countries turned inward, focusing on survival rather than cooperation. The League of Nations, meant to be a beacon of unity, became increasingly irrelevant as member states ignored its calls and pursued their own interests. The dream that had once burned bright in Geneva began to flicker. Still, some continued to believe. Secretaries, diplomats, and peace activists wrote passionately about reforming the League, giving it more authority, creating a real system of collective defense. But no such changes came. The governments that needed to act were too divided, too afraid, or too self-interested. As the 1930s approached, the League stood like a noble monument from a forgotten age, grand in vision, hollow in strength. In hindsight, the League's failure seemed inevitable. It was built on hope, but hope alone cannot stand against ambition, greed, and fear. Its creators wanted to make war unthinkable, but they underestimated the power of resentment and revenge. Each decision that required unanimity, each sanction that went unenforced, each aggressor that went unpunished chipped away at its credibility. What began as a dream of peace slowly became a symbol of weakness. Yet, it would be unfair to dismiss the League entirely as a failure. In its heart, it carried a profound truth that the world needed cooperation to survive. Though it stumbled and fell, it left behind lessons that would shape the creation of the United Nations after World War II. The League was humanity's first great experiment in global governance, and like all first experiments, it was flawed, imperfect, and ultimately unsuccessful. But it marked a beginning, the moment when nations first dared to think beyond their borders, to imagine peace as a shared responsibility. As the 1920s drew to a close, the League still stood, its flag fluttering gently over Geneva, a symbol of hope for some, of futility for others. Few could see what lay ahead: the rise of dictators, the failure of diplomacy, and the outbreak of an even greater war that would engulf the world once more. The dream that had been born in the ashes of the Great War was fading. The world had wanted peace, but it had built it on fragile ground. And soon, that ground would crumble. Cracks in the wall, 1931 to 1939. The world entered the 1930s with uncertainty hanging in the air. The glow of post-war optimism had long faded, and the League of Nations, once hailed as the guardian of peace, stood quietly in Geneva, wrapped in formality but stripped of authority. Outside its marble halls, a storm was brewing. The Great Depression had shaken the very foundations of global society. Millions were out of work, industries were collapsing, and governments were losing control. Desperation replaced diplomacy, and as hunger grew, so did anger. In the shadows of this chaos, three nations, Japan, Italy, and Germany, began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward conquest. It began in the East. In 1931, Japan struck the first blow against the fragile peace when it invaded Manchuria, a rich region of northern China. The world was stunned. China, a member of the League, cried out for help, pleading for justice. Delegates in Geneva debated, argued, and drafted reports, but time passed, and Japan's soldiers tightened their grip on Chinese soil. The League sent the Lytton Commission to investigate, but by the time it arrived, Japan had already set up its puppet state of Manchukuo. Months later, when the report finally condemned Japan's aggression, Tokyo simply walked out of the League. No sanctions, no military action, no consequences, just silence. The message to the world was clear: the League's words carried no weight. The Manchurian crisis was the League's first great test, and it failed miserably. The aggressors had discovered a dangerous truth: the world would protest, but it would not act. Britain and France, the only powers strong enough to intervene, were unwilling to risk war over distant Asia. Both nations were still reeling from the Depression, both feared confrontation. And so they chose caution over courage. In the newspapers, the League's name began to lose its meaning. To millions, it no longer stood for hope, but for hesitation. As Japan expanded in the East, another dictator prepared his move in Europe. In 1935, Benito Mussolini, the proud and ambitious leader of fascist Italy, turned his eyes toward Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, one of the few independent African nations left. Mussolini wanted glory, revenge, and empire. When Italian troops invaded Abyssinia with tanks and poison gas, the League once again called an emergency meeting. Words of condemnation filled the chamber, speeches echoed about justice and law, but again, action fell short. The League imposed economic sanctions, banning the sale of arms and certain goods to Italy, but it deliberately excluded vital materials like oil, steel, and coal. Britain and France feared that angering Mussolini too much would push him toward an alliance with Hitler. So, the sanctions were half-hearted, the punishment incomplete. Italy ignored them and completed its conquest. By 1936, Mussolini marched triumphantly into Addis Ababa, while the League stood humiliated. That humiliation was not lost on the world. To the rising powers of Europe and Asia, it proved that collective security was a myth. The League could issue resolutions but not resistance. The word sanction became synonymous with failure. For Mussolini, the victory emboldened his ambitions. For Hitler, watching from Berlin, it confirmed what he had already suspected: no one would stop him either. While the League stumbled, Hitler was rebuilding Germany at a breathtaking pace. He tore up the Treaty of Versailles, rearmed the nation, and filled factories with weapons. In 1936, he marched troops into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized after World War I. It was a direct violation of the treaty and a blatant act of defiance. Yet once again, the League did nothing. France, terrified of another war, refused to act without British support. Britain, hoping to maintain peace, dismissed the move as Germany's right to its own territory. No one wanted conflict, and so the aggressor walked free. Hitler's gamble had paid off. The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of my life, he would later admit. If the French had marched in, we would have had to withdraw. But they didn't. And from that moment, Hitler knew the world's fear was his greatest weapon. By the late 1930s, the League of Nations was little more than a stage where diplomats performed the ritual of peace while dictators prepared for war. Japan withdrew. Germany withdrew. Italy withdrew. One by one, the pillars that held the League together began to collapse. The meetings in Geneva continued formal, polished, and increasingly meaningless. Outside, the world was dividing into camps of aggression and appeasement. The next blow came in 1936 when Germany and Italy intervened in the Spanish Civil War, supporting General Franco's fascist forces. Despite clear evidence of their involvement, the League declared a policy of non-intervention, effectively turning a blind eye as Spain burned. Bombers from Germany's Luftwaffe leveled the town of Guernica, killing hundreds of civilians. The League said nothing. Its silence became complicity. Each unpunished act of aggression pushed the world one step closer to catastrophe. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan continued its rampage. In 1937, it launched a full-scale invasion of China, capturing city after city, culminating in the horrific Nanjing massacre, where hundreds of thousands were killed. China appealed once again to the League, but there was no response. The Western powers were too entangled in their own problems to care. The League's chamber echoed with speeches, but beyond Geneva, the world was already at war, piece by piece, continent by continent. By 1938, Hitler had become unstoppable. He annexed Austria in the Anschluss, declaring it part of the German Reich. It was another blatant violation of international law, but again, the League remained silent. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, continued their policy of appeasement. The final humiliation came later that year when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia. At the Munich conference, without consulting the League or even the Czechs, Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Edouard Daladier agreed to Hitler's demands, believing they had secured peace for our time. They returned home to applause, but it was an illusion. Within months, Hitler broke his promise and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations didn't even meet to discuss it. Its purpose had vanished. The 1930s had begun with promise and ended in betrayal. The League's silence had allowed dictators to rewrite the rules of the world. Japan, Italy, and Germany, each emboldened by inaction, had carved their empires in blood. Collective security had collapsed under the weight of cowardice and self-interest. The dream of 1919 was gone, replaced by a grim reality: power respected only power. By 1939, the League of Nations stood like an abandoned monument, still existing on paper but empty in spirit. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, triggering the Second World War, the League did not even convene. There were no protests, no meetings, no appeals. The world had returned to chaos, and the organization created to prevent that chaos had already died a slow, silent death. In Geneva, the League's flag still fluttered above its building, but few looked up anymore. The corridors that once echoed with speeches of peace now stood quiet. Diplomats packed their papers, committees dissolved, and the great experiment of international cooperation faded into history. The cracks in the wall had become chasms, and through them poured the fire of a new war. The collapse and consequences, 1939 to 1945. When the first bombs fell over Poland in September 1939, the last light of the League of Nations went out. The dream that had been built 20 years earlier on the ashes of one world war was now buried beneath the ruins of another. The streets of Geneva were calm, but the silence was deceptive. Inside the League's grand building, the Palais des Nations, corridors that once echoed with speeches of peace now stood empty. The organization that had promised to keep the world from tearing itself apart could only watch as nations plunged headlong into destruction once again. The League didn't even attempt to stop the war this time. There were no urgent sessions, no passionate debates, no resolutions. It had become a ghost existing in name, but stripped of relevance. The nations that once filled its chambers were now enemies on the battlefield. Germany and Italy had long withdrawn. Japan had turned eastward, fighting its own war of conquest in Asia. The Soviet Union, which had briefly joined in the 1930s, had been expelled in 1939 after attacking Finland. Britain and France, the League's founding pillars, were now fighting for survival. The institution created to prevent war was being crushed under the weight of a war greater than anything the world had ever seen. In those early months, the League's officials tried to maintain the illusion of order. Committees continued to meet, reports were written, correspondence was exchanged, but it was all ceremonial, like a play continuing long after the audience had gone home. When German forces marched across Europe, occupying Denmark, Norway, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the League remained silent. Its archives were moved for safety, some staff fled Geneva as the war approached Switzerland's borders. The noble vision that had once inspired millions was now reduced to paperwork and dust. Meanwhile, the world outside was burning. Hitler's armies unleashed the Blitz across London, Mussolini's troops fought in North Africa, and Japan's empire expanded across the Pacific. The war spread from continent to continent, consuming everything in its path. The League had no voice in any of it. The idea of collective security, once its proud foundation, had dissolved completely. In its place stood a new kind of order, an order forged not by cooperation but by force. As the war deepened, the world saw horrors that made the failure of the League even more tragic. Entire cities were turned into rubble. Millions of civilians were displaced or killed. The Holocaust exposed the darkest depths of humanity, with 6 million Jews and millions of others exterminated under the Nazi regime. The League had been created to prevent such atrocities, but by the 1940s, it no longer had the authority, influence, or credibility to act. Its silence became a symbol of the world's indifference to suffering when ideals collapse under reality. By 1942, the world's focus had shifted entirely to the war effort. But even amidst the chaos, some leaders began to think about what would come after. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met to discuss the Atlantic Charter, envisioning a new international order, one that would succeed where the League had failed. The charter called for freedom, justice, and collective security, but this time, its designers wanted a structure with real power and participation from all major nations, including the United States. The idea of the United Nations was quietly born amid the smoke of war, long before peace had returned. Back in Geneva, the League of Nations still technically existed, though its purpose was gone. A skeleton staff handled small humanitarian issues, refugees, prisoners of war, health missions, but even these were overshadowed by the enormity of global conflict. The building that once hosted grand assemblies now echoed with loneliness. Delegates who had once shaken hands in optimism were now either in exile or fighting on opposite sides. The League's flag still fluttered outside the Palladian nations, but even the wind seemed to move slower there, as if mourning what could have been. In 1943 and 1944, as Allied forces began to turn the tide of war, discussions about the post-war world became more serious. It was clear to everyone that the League was finished. The organization had failed not because its purpose was wrong, but because it had been born into a world that wasn't ready for it. Nations still thought in terms of empire, competition, and revenge. Peace had been an ideal, not a practice. The League's structure, requiring unanimous votes and lacking military force, had made it powerless. But even in failure, it had provided valuable lessons. Those lessons became the blueprint for the United Nations, which would soon rise in its place. By 1945, as the war reached its brutal conclusion, the League's story was over. Germany had fallen, Mussolini was dead, and Japan faced destruction. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the fighting, but also marked the dawn of a terrifying new age. The cost of the war was beyond comprehension: over 50 million lives lost, entire nations shattered, and a world once again desperate for peace. In this broken landscape, the dream of international cooperation was revived, but not under the League's flag. In April 1945, representatives from 50 countries gathered in San Francisco to draft the Charter of the United Nations. Many of them had witnessed the League's collapse firsthand, and they were determined not to repeat its mistakes. They gave the UN a Security Council with real authority, including the power to enforce decisions and deploy military action. The major powers this time, including the United States and the Soviet Union, were placed at its center. The UN's founders understood a harsh truth the League had ignored: peace could not survive without power to protect it. When the United Nations officially came into being later that year, the League of Nations still technically existed, though it was a mere shadow of itself. In 1946, one final meeting was held in Geneva to formally dissolve it. The assembly was small, somber, and symbolic. Delegates spoke quietly about the League's contributions and its failures. Some wept as the organization that had once carried humanity's greatest hope was officially declared dead. The remaining assets, archives, and responsibilities were transferred to the United Nations. The lights in the Palladian nations were dimmed, and with that gesture, an era ended. Yet, the League's legacy lived on. Its very failure taught the world what not to do. It showed that peace could not be maintained by speeches alone, that moral outrage meant little without action, and that idealism needed strength behind it. The League had been too gentle for a brutal age, too moral for a world still drunk on power. But without it, the United Nations might never have been born. The experiment had failed, but the lesson endured. As Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins of war, the memory of the League faded into the background of history. Children who had once been told it would end all wars grew up amid rubble and rationing, skeptical of promises. But scholars, diplomats, and leaders who studied its story understood its deeper significance. The League of Nations was not just a failed institution, it was humanity's first real attempt to govern itself collectively, to rise above nationalism and revenge. And though it collapsed under the weight of reality, it left behind a foundation upon which a better system could be built. In the end, the League's downfall was not just the story of an organization, it was the story of humanity learning, painfully and slowly, that peace is not something declared, it is something defended. Its rise and fall became a mirror of the world it tried to serve, idealistic, divided, and forever struggling between hope and power. The war that followed its failure destroyed much, but it also gave birth to the realization that cooperation was not a dream, it was a necessity. And perhaps, in that way, the League of Nations did not truly die, it simply evolved into a new form, reborn from the ashes of its own defeat. The legacy of failure, lessons for the modern world. The story of the League of Nations did not end when its doors closed in Geneva in 1946, it merely changed shape, living on quietly in the corridors of history. Long after the flags were lowered and the final delegates had gone home, the idea behind it continued to breathe like an ember that refused to die out completely. The world had moved on, rebuilt itself from the ruins of war, and embraced a new organization, the United Nations, as the symbol of renewed hope. But behind every United Nations resolution, every peacekeeping mission, and every diplomatic treaty, the ghost of the League still whispered its warnings. Its failure was no longer just a chapter of the past, it had become a teacher for the future. In the years that followed World War II, nations were busy repairing cities, economies, and hearts. Europe was a patchwork of destruction, Asia too had been scorched by conflict. Yet amid the chaos, there was a quiet determination not to make the same mistakes again. The diplomats who built the New World Order remembered what had gone wrong the last time, how arrogance, division, and hesitation had drowned an entire generation's dream of peace. For them, the League of Nations was not a forgotten relic, it was a constant reminder of how fragile peace could be when power and principle drift apart. The League's greatest tragedy had not been its weakness alone, it was the fact that it had represented humanity at its most hopeful. When it was created, people genuinely believed they were entering a new age, an age where reason would triumph over rage. Its founders spoke of justice, fairness, and unity, and for a brief moment, the world had believed in them. But reality had been cruel. The same nations that had vowed to uphold peace had betrayed those ideals when it became inconvenient to defend them. The world learned that noble speeches could not stop tanks, and moral outrage could not outshout the sound of bombs. That lesson, carved in the ruins of the 1930s, became the foundation stone of the United Nations. The UN, unlike its predecessor, was built with muscle. It had a Security Council that could take decisive action. It had permanent members with both authority and responsibility. Most importantly, it included the very powers whose absence had doomed the League, the United States and the Soviet Union. The idea was not to eliminate disagreement, but to contain it, to keep the balance of peace alive even amid conflict. The League had tried to create harmony through idealism, the UN accepted that peace often required realism. That difference would define the post-war world. Yet, the shadow of the League continued to stretch across the decades. In the Cold War that followed, the same patterns began to appear: ideological blocks, vetoes, political paralysis. The United Nations sometimes found itself trapped in the same contradictions, preaching unity while nations pursued self-interest. Each time that happened, historians and diplomats turned back to the League's story as a warning. It reminded them that peace was not a permanent condition, it was something fragile, constantly tested by greed, fear, and ambition. The League's legacy also transformed how people thought about collective responsibility. Before it, the idea of nations cooperating beyond borders was almost unimaginable. Empires ruled through dominance, not dialogue. But after the League, international cooperation became an expectation, not an exception. Organizations like the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and International Court of Justice all carried its DNA. The League had tried to make the world smaller, to make nations see each other not as rivals but as partners. It failed to achieve that vision in its lifetime, but the seed it planted grew later, quietly, through institutions that endure even today. Still, the League's failure left deep moral scars. It forced humanity to confront its own hypocrisy. How easily nations had spoken of justice while ignoring injustice. How quickly they had abandoned the victims of aggression to save themselves from trouble. The Manchurian crisis, Abyssinia, Spain, Czechoslovakia each had exposed a world unwilling to sacrifice comfort for principle. Those failures redefined how people understood peace. It was no longer about the absence of war, it became about the presence of courage. Peace, the world learned, required nations willing to act even when it was costly. In modern times, as new conflicts emerge in Ukraine, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond, the lessons of the League echo louder than ever. Every time the international community hesitates to intervene, every time politics overrides humanity, the same ghosts return to haunt the world. The League's story reminds us that evil often grows not in the presence of war but in the absence of action. Indifference, more than aggression, is what destroys peace from within. There's also a quieter, more human legacy to the League's story. Among its staff were idealists, diplomats, doctors, journalists, people who truly believed they were building a better world. Many of them later helped shape the early United Nations, carrying their experience forward. They knew what failure felt like, and they knew how costly it had been. To them, the League was not just an institution, it was a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle between idealism and realism. The dream of peace, though bruised, had survived because people refused to give up on it completely. In Geneva today, the Palais des Nations still stands, now serving as one of the main offices of the United Nations. Visitors who walk its long corridors can still feel traces of that earlier era, the optimism, the speeches, the desperation. The walls have seen both hope and heartbreak. Some of the old League symbols remain, faded but visible, like faint fingerprints of a time when the world believed peace could be negotiated once and for all. Standing there, one can almost hear the echo of those early voices, the belief that nations could overcome their divisions if only they dared to try. And perhaps that's the real meaning of the League's legacy. It wasn't about perfection, but persistence. The League failed, yes, but it proved that even in failure, progress can be born. It forced the world to grow up, to understand that peace cannot be built on promises alone. The United Nations that followed would make its own mistakes, face its own criticisms, but it carried within it the wisdom that the League had earned through pain. Without the League's collapse, the world might never have learned how to build something stronger. Looking back now, the League of Nations feels both distant and familiar. Distant, because it belonged to another century, a world before television, before nuclear weapons, before globalization. Familiar, because the same struggles continue, the tension between national pride and global unity, between speaking and acting, between fear and hope. Humanity still stands on that same tightrope, trying not to fall. The League's story remains a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of us. When history is written, success often overshadows failure. But in the case of the League of Nations, its failure may have been its greatest contribution. It showed that peace is not a guarantee, it is a choice that must be made again and again, every generation, by every nation. It taught that silence in the face of injustice is the first step toward chaos. And it reminded us that the cost of inaction is always higher than the cost of courage. In the quiet of Geneva, as night falls over the Palais des Nations, the lights of the United Nations burn softly in the same windows where the League once dreamed of peace. The building stands as a bridge between two worlds: the world that tried and failed, and the world that learned and endured. The League of Nations may be gone, but its story remains etched into the conscience of humanity, whispering a single, timeless truth, that even when peace falls, the will to rebuild it must never fade.